Frostbite smells like absolutely nothing but desperation. Desperation smells exactly like a 1.99 bundle of dried sage from a gas station. I watched the hydraulic winch of the tow truck scream as it hoisted my rusted Ford Econoline into the air. The tires, completely bald and caked in dirty gray slush, spun uselessly one last time before locking into place. That van wasn't just my transportation, it was my storage unit, my mobile workshop, and on the nights when the rent was short my bedroom. Now it belonged to a debt collection agency in Albany. Nothing personal, kid. The repo guy grunted his breath, pluming in the freezing upstate New York air. He didn't even look at me as he tossed a clipboard onto the passenger seat of his truck. Bank wants its cut. You got 3 days to clear the balance before it goes to auction. I didn't answer. I just stood there in the ankle-deep slush, my hands shoved deep into the pockets of a canvas jacket that was 3 seasons too thin. At my feet sat a heavy, dented metal toolbox, the only thing I had managed to drag out of the back before they hooked the chains. The tow truck rumbled away, its red taillights bleeding into the bruised twilight sky. I was 24 and Omega with 0 prospects, freezing to death in a suburban parking lot. I pulled a crumpled stick of sage from my inner pocket, struck a cheap match, and let the acrid burning smoke wash over the collar of my jacket. I coughed as the harsh scent invaded my lungs, but I welcomed the sting. My natural scent, a bleak mixture of cold fog and rotting wood, was already depressing enough. When I panicked, it spiked with a sharp, bitter ozone smell that practically painted a target on my back for any alpha within a 1-mile radius. So I drowned myself in sage. It made me smell like a holistic scam artist, but it kept me invisible. And invisibility was the only armor I could afford. My stomach gave a hollow, aggressive growl. I hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. I knelt in the wet snow, ignoring the ice seeping through the knees of my jeans, and opened the toolbox. Nestled between a pipe wrench and a tub of industrial spackle was a piece of paper I had ripped off a telephone pole 2 weeks ago. It was stained with coffee and grease, but the bold capitalized letters were still legible. Blackwood Manor, urgent. Paranormal entity removal or structural handyman required. Hazard pay included. Cash upon completion of daily tasks. Blackwood Manor. Everyone in the county knew about the Gilded Age monstrosity sitting on the frozen hill outside of town. It had been abandoned for decades until some reclusive tech or real estate billionaire bought it sight unseen. Rumor had it the place was cursed, haunted by the miserable souls of the servants who died building it. 3 contracting crews had already quit leaving their tools behind, claiming doors slammed on their own, and the temperature would drop to freezing inside closed rooms. People were terrified. I wasn't. A poltergeist couldn't ruin my credit score. A demon couldn't repossess my toolbox. To me, the supernatural was just a structural defect with an attitude problem. Poverty was the only monster I believed in. I picked up the heavy toolbox by its freezing iron handle and started walking. By the time I reached the wrought iron gates of Blackwood Manor, the sun had completely vanished, leaving behind a bone-chilling darkness. The gates were massive, twisted like dead black vines against the snow. The driveway was long and treacherous, leading up to a towering silhouette of gray stone and sharp turrets that looked like teeth chewing on the night sky. I shifted the toolbox to my other hand, my frozen fingers screaming in protest. Just as I took a step toward the pedestrian entrance, a pair of blinding LED headlights swept across me. A sleek, heavily armored black SUV, the kind that screamed absolute untouchable wealth, glided silently up the driveway. It stopped right next to me. The engine purred a deep, expensive sound. Slowly, the tinted rear window rolled down halfway. I expected a security guard telling me to get lost. Instead, the air in the immediate vicinity abruptly shifted. The biting cold of the winter wind was suddenly suffocated by a scent so rich, so overwhelmingly dominant, that my knees actually buckled a fraction of an inch. Cedar wood, aged dark cedar wood, and the sharp, smoky tang of burning parchment. It was an alpha scent, pure and unadulterated by chemical blockers. It didn't just reach my nose, it slammed into my chest, a biological command demanding submission. I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste copper, forcing myself to stand straight. I looked into the dark interior of the car. He was sitting in the shadows. I couldn't make out his exact features, just the sharp line of a jaw, the broad expanse of a tailored wool coat, and eyes that were fixed on me with a terrifying hollow intensity. This was Vaughn Sterling. He didn't speak. He just inhaled. I saw his jaw tighten. A microscopic wince of pure, unadulterated disgust crossed his face as my cheap, burning gas station sage hit his highly sensitive, aristocratic nose. I was a foul-smelling, freezing peasant standing in his pristine driveway. We stared at each other for 3 agonizing seconds, a clash of 2 entirely different universes. Then, without a single word, the window rolled up, sealing him back inside his climate-controlled billion-dollar bubble. The SUV glided forward, leaving me in its exhaust fumes. "Nice to meet you too, Your Highness," I muttered to the empty air, my voice raspy and bitter. I trudged up the rest of the driveway, the manor looming larger and more oppressive with every step. I finally reached the massive front porch. The front doors were heavy oak, scarred by time and neglect. As I stood there, a sudden violent gust of wind whipped around the porch. The heavy oak door unlatched on its own, slowly creaking inward into the pitch-black hallway. It sounded like a dying breath. It was the kind of ominous cinematic horror that would make any sane person turn around and run back to civilization. I sighed, dropping my metal toolbox onto the stone porch with a loud, irreverent metallic thud. I flipped the latches open, bypassed the crucifix and the holy water I had bought at a dollar store, and pulled out a can of WD-40. "Nothing a little lubricant can't banish," I said, shaking the can. I stepped into the dark. If ghosts actually existed, they had terrible taste in interior design. Blackwood Manor's grand foyer was a cavernous tomb of dark mahogany rotting velvet drapes and an overarching smell of damp stone. The demonic howling the previous contractors had reported was just a severe draft coming through the warped window frames. I spent my first 2 hours aggressively applying industrial caulk and heavy-duty weather stripping. Take that, forces of darkness. But around midnight, the physics of the room stopped making sense. I was kneeling on the scuffed Gilded Age oak floor trying to pry open a rusted heating grate when my breath started pluming into the air. The temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted like a stone, freezing the sweat on the back of my neck. Then the heavy iron pipe wrench resting by my knee slowly lifted 3 feet into the air. It hovered there, defying gravity, rotating slightly as if held by an invisible, curious hand. Most people would scream. Most people would run out into the snow and never look back. I just sighed, the sound echoing loudly in the empty hall. "Put it down," I muttered, not looking up from the grate. "I need that to unscrew the flange." The wrench suddenly shot across the room, smashing into the stone fireplace with a loud metallic crash. I flinched, but before I could retrieve it, an invisible force swept across my workspace. My open toolbox rattled violently, but what made my blood run instantly hot was the sound of sloshing liquid. A loud splashing sound echoed as a gallon bucket of anti-static primer, the expensive stuff I had literally scraped my last few dollars together to buy, was tipped completely on its side. A thick, chalky white puddle was rapidly expanding across the antique floorboards. "Are you kidding me?" I roared, surging to my feet. I didn't care if it was a demon, a poltergeist, or the devil himself. I pointed an angry paint-stained finger at the empty air. "That primer cost me $50. 50. Do you know how many hours I have to snake clog drains to make $50? You translucent deadbeat, if you are going to throw a temper tantrum, break the rich guy's chandelier, not my equipment." The air around me shivered. A freezing wind whipped my hair, a clear sign of supernatural hostility, but I was too furious about my ruined budget to care. I grabbed a fistful of dirty rags and dropped to my knees, frantically scrubbing the white primer off the dark oak before it could set. "What the hell are you doing to my floor?" The voice was low resonant and hit the back of my neck like a physical weight. I froze my hands, still buried in wet paint rags. The temperature in the room was already freezing, but the air suddenly grew impossibly thick. That crushing, expensive scent rolled over me again, aged cedarwood and sharp, smoky parchment. I slowly turned my head. Von Sterling was standing in the doorway of the foyer. He had shed his heavy wool coat, revealing a tailored black suit that looked like it cost more than a kidney on the black market. His tie was pulled loose, and he looked entirely exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin under his piercing eyes, and he was rubbing his left temple as if fighting off a brutal migraine. He stared down at me. I was a filthy, shivering Omega in cheap canvas overalls, kneeling in a puddle of white paint, smelling like cheap gas station sage and chemical primer. "I'm cleaning up a mess," I snapped, standing up. I wiped my hands on my thighs, leaving white streaks on my jeans. "Your ghost has anger management issues." Vaughn's jaw tightened. There are no ghosts. There is only a fraud making a racket in my house at midnight. Pack your tools. I am calling my security team to escort you off the property. My stomach dropped. If he kicked me out now, I wouldn't get paid. If I didn't get paid, I was sleeping in a snowbank by tomorrow night. Fear spiked my heart rate, and with it, my biological suppressants already weakened by hunger, and the cold flickered. My real scent leaked out. Just a fraction. A sharp, icy burst of cold fog and damp, rotting wood cutting straight through the overwhelming smell of my burning sage. Vaughn instantly stopped rubbing his temple. His dark eyes widened a fraction of an inch, locking onto me. The tension in his broad shoulders visibly dropped. I watched bewildered as the harsh lines of his migraine, strained face smoothed out. My harsh, defensive, unappealing scent was somehow neutralizing his alpha headache. He realized it a second later. His expression shuddered, turning cold and deeply unreadable. He took a slow step back as if disgusted by his own biological reaction. "Get out," he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "No," I said. Vaughn blinked. "Nobody told billionaires no. I don't leave until the job is done. And I don't work in a hostile environment," I said, my voice shaking slightly, though whether from the freezing air or the sheer audacity of my own words, I wasn't sure. I reached into my back pocket, pulled out a crumpled piece of notebook paper and a black marker. I slapped the paper onto an antique marble console table and started writing furiously. "What are you doing?" Vaughn demanded, stepping closer. "Drafting a roommate agreement," I stated flatly. I finished writing, capped the marker with my teeth, and shoved the paper toward him. "Sign it." Vaughn looked down at the grease-stained paper. I watched his eyes scan the messy handwriting. 1. No supernatural phenomena after 10 p.m. I need to sleep. 2. No aggressive alpha pheromone dumping in common areas. It gives me a rash. 3. Any damage to my tools will be deducted directly from the final invoice. Vaughn stared at the paper for a long, agonizing moment. Then he looked up at me as if I had completely lost my mind. "You expect me to sign a lease agreement with a hallucination?" Before I could answer, the black marker on the table vibrated. Slowly, deliberately, it floated 6 inches into the air. Vaughn froze, his breath hitching. We both watched as the marker hovered over the bottom of the paper, pressed down, and aggressively scribbled a thick, chaotic ink blot right next to where it said, "Signature of Entity." The marker dropped back onto the marble with a sharp clicking sound. I tapped the paper with a paint-stained finger. The ghost signed, "Your turn, landlord." Vaughn Sterling, a man who likely commanded boardrooms and terrified CEOs, stood in absolute stunned silence. He looked at the ink blot, then at the floating primer fumes, and finally down at me. The absurdity of the situation had completely short-circuited his corporate brain. Without a word, he pulled a solid gold pen from his inner jacket pocket, clicked it open, and signed his name next to the ghost's ink blot. He turned on his heel and walked up the grand staircase, leaving me alone in the freezing foyer. "Great," I muttered to the empty room. "Now help me clean up this paint before it dries, Barnaby." Living with a billionaire and a poltergeist required a very specific kind of compartmentalization. By the second week, a bizarre domestic rhythm had settled over Blackwood Manor. Barnaby, the name I had officially assigned to our resident entity, had a weird fixation on my tools. He liked to levitate my 10mm sockets and hide them inside the antique grandfather clock. Every time he did, I aggressively scribbled a $5 deduction into my ghost tax ledger left on the foyer table. Vaughn Sterling, on the other hand, was a completely different kind of haunting. He didn't kick me out. In fact, he started lingering. I would be on a ladder in the library replacing rotted window sashes, and I would feel the sudden heavy shift in the air pressure. The overwhelming scent of expensive cedarwood and parchment would roll in, signaling his arrival. He would just stand in the doorway, hands shoved into the pockets of his slacks, watching me work in total silence. It made my skin itch, my inner omega instincts bristling at the intense alpha scrutiny, but I was too stubborn to ask him to leave. The fragile piece shattered on a Tuesday over a roll of duct tape. I was trying to temporarily seal a cracked PVC pipe in the basement and realized I was out of heavy-duty adhesive. Vaughn, who was apparently tired of hearing water drip echoing through the floorboards, told his assistant to procure some. An hour later, a courier arrived with a sleek matte black box. Inside was a roll of artisan aerospace-grade bonding tape. The receipt fluttered to the floor. I picked it up. $120. I marched up the stairs, my steel-toed boots slamming against the hardwood, and found Vaughn in the dining room nursing a glass of scotch. I slammed the receipt onto the mahogany table right next to his crystal tumbler. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice rough with sawdust and sheer disbelief. Vaughn blinked, looking mildly annoyed by the interruption. "It's the tape you needed." I expedited the process. "It's $120, Vaughn," I yelled, dropping the title of Mr. Sterling entirely, "for a single roll of tape. Do you have any concept of reality? Do you know what $120 means?" His jaw tightened. "It means the pipe gets fixed tonight. It means 2 weeks of groceries." I fired back, leaning over the table, my fake sage scent spiking with genuine bitter frustration. "It means a pair of winter boots that actually keep the snow out. It means keeping the heat on for a month so you don't wake up with blue lips. You threw away a week of someone's life on tape because you were mildly inconvenienced by a dripping sound." Vaughn stood up. His imposing height and broad shoulders usually commanded absolute submission, but I was too deeply offended by his casual wealth to care. We stood inches apart, his dark eyes locked onto mine, searching for the usual omega deference, the instinct to shrink back. He found none. "I have snaked human waste out of frozen drains at 3 in the morning for $40, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper. "Don't you dare bring your billionaire math into my workspace. You want to help? Go buy a $3 roll of silver tape from the gas station like a normal person." I turned my back on him, fully expecting to be fired. I waited for the heavy alpha command, the crushing pheromones designed to force me to my knees. It never came. When I looked back, Vaughn was just staring at the receipt, a complicated, hollow look in his eyes. He didn't say a word. Later that night, the kitchen was freezing. Barnaby had short-circuited the ultra-modern microwave out of sheer spite, so I was hunched over my cheap camping stove, boiling water for a 99-cent box of neon orange macaroni and cheese. The heavy kitchen doors swung open. Vaughn walked in. He had taken off his suit jacket and tie, the top buttons of his crisp white shirt undone. To my absolute shock, he was holding a cheap, battered roll of silver duct tape with a gas station price tag still stuck to the side. He placed it quietly on the granite counter. I stared at it, then at him. The knot of tension in my chest loosened just a fraction. "Thanks," I muttered, stirring my noodles. He didn't leave. He sat on one of the expensive bar stools, watching the blue flame of my camping stove. "Why does the ghost hate the appliances?" he asked, his voice low, devoid of its usual corporate edge. "Because he died from the cold," I said simply. I tapped my wooden spoon on the edge of the pot. I found an old maintenance ledger in the basement. 1941. Blackwood Manor had a caretaker named Barnaby. A massive blizzard hit, and the owners, some railroad tycoons, were out of town. They had locked the coal reserves to prevent the staff from stealing. Barnaby spent 3 days trying to keep the pipes from freezing until his heart gave out. I poured the powdered cheese into the pot, the artificial smell filling the cold room. I scooped a small portion into a chipped porcelain bowl and slid it down the counter, leaving it empty. "I get it," I said, looking into the empty, freezing corners of the kitchen. "The rich guys left you to die to save a few bucks on coal. If I were you, I would break their fancy microwave too." Solidarity, Barnaby. The temperature in the kitchen suddenly ticked up. The biting chill in the air softened into a gentle, tolerable cool. The flickering kitchen lights stabilized. Barnaby was listening. Vaughn sat perfectly still. He looked at the bowl of cheap pasta left out for a dead, forgotten worker, and then he looked at me. The realization hit him. He was exactly the kind of man Barnaby had died hating. And he was exactly the kind of man I despised. I didn't know Vaughn whispered, and for the first time he sounded genuinely human. An hour later, we were back under the sink. I was wedged halfway into the cabinet wrench in hand wrestling with the PVC. "Hold the flashlight steady." I grunted, my arm burning from the awkward angle. Vaughn was kneeling on the cold tile next to me. The billionaire was actually sitting in the dust, holding a yellow plastic flashlight. He shifted closer. His warm breath brushed against the side of my neck. My natural scent, the damp, cold fog I tried so hard to hide, leaked past the fading sage. Vaughn inhaled slowly. He didn't flinch this time. He didn't look disgusted. "Got it," I huffed, pulling myself out from under the sink. I sat back on my heels, wiping my forehead with the back of my hand. I felt a smear of thick black pipe grease streak across my cheekbone. Damn it. I reached for a rag, but Vaughn moved first. He reached out, his large, warm hand hovering in the air for a split second before his bare thumb brushed against my cheek. He gently wiped the black grease from my skin. The touch was electric. It wasn't an alpha claiming an omega. It was a man touching another man. The sheer terrifying intimacy of it made my breath completely stop in my lungs. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Vaughn's dark eyes were bottomless, fixed on mine. He didn't pull away. His thumb lingered on my jawline. A heavy cast iron pan suddenly clattered to the floor from the drying rack, making a deafening noise. We both violently jumped apart of the spell, instantly broken. I scrambled to my feet, my face burning hotter than the camping stove. "I have to check the pressure valve," I said, grabbing my toolbox and fleeing the kitchen. I didn't look back, but I knew the boundary between us had just irreparably cracked. And Barnaby, the translucent deadbeat, had definitely dropped that pan on purpose. The fragile truce lasted exactly 4 days. Then the real world kicked the front door in. It was a Thursday evening. I was in the grand foyer methodically scraping decades of grime off the baseboards when the heavy oak doors violently burst open. The winter wind howled into the room, bringing with it 3 men in heavy Carhartt jackets. I recognized the lead guy, immediately the repo man from the Albany parking lot. They hadn't just taken my van, they had sold my debt to a predatory collection agency, and my GPS data had apparently come with the package. They tracked dirt and melting slush onto the antique wood, but worse than the mud was the smell. They reeked of stale beer, cheap chewing tobacco, and a sour, aggressive brand of synthetic alpha pheromones designed to intimidate. "Thought you could hide in a haunted house, kid." The lead guy sneered, his heavy boots echoing loudly. "You owe the agency $4,000. We're here to collect your tools, your copper wire, whatever you got." I stood up slowly, my fingers tightening around the cold iron handle of my scraper. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, terrified rhythm. I was outnumbered, exhausted, and running on half rations. But before I could even open my mouth to tell them to get out of the physics of the room aggressively snapped. Barnaby did not like uninvited guests. The temperature in the foyer didn't just drop, it died. In a matter of seconds, thick crystalline frost spiderwebbed across the mahogany walls. The massive crystal chandelier overhead swung violently, shattering several bulbs with a deafening crash. A literal gale-force wind whipped through the closed room, howling like a wounded animal. The 3 thugs froze their aggressive pheromones, immediately souring into pure, unfiltered panic. But the supernatural blizzard wasn't what broke me. It was the shock. The sudden violent spike in my heart rate combined with the hostile foreign alphas and the freezing temperature completely shattered the cheap gas station suppressants in my bloodstream. My heat didn't arrive with a romantic flush. It hit me like a runaway freight train. My knees instantly gave out. A burning, agonizing cramp seized my lower spine, dropping me to the icy floorboards. I gasped for air, but my lungs felt filled with wet sand. My body's internal temperature regulation completely collapsed. I was freezing on the outside, but my blood felt like boiling acid. My scent, usually a damp, quiet fog, exploded into a chaotic, burnt distress signal. The smell of crushed rosemary and panic flooded the foyer, thick enough to choke on. The thugs, terrified by the flying objects and the sudden drop in temperature, were scrambling backward, but the heavy doors had slammed shut on their own courtesy of Barnaby. They were trapped, swearing and kicking at the wood. Then Vaughn appeared at the top of the grand staircase. He didn't look like a billionaire CEO. He looked like an apex predator whose territory had just been breached. His dark eyes locked onto the 3 men and then darted to where I was curled on the floor, shaking uncontrollably. He didn't pull out his checkbook. He didn't call his security team. He simply walked down the stairs. The lead thug turned, raising his fists, but Vaughn moved with a brutal, terrifying efficiency. He didn't fight like a gentleman. He grabbed the man by the collar of his heavy jacket and drove a knee squarely into his ribs. A sickening, cracking sound echoed over the howling wind. He shoved the second man backward so hard the guy tripped over my toolbox and crashed into the stone fireplace. Vaughn unlatched the heavy front doors with one hand and physically threw the bleeding men out into the snow. He slammed the doors shut, throwing the deadbolt. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Barnaby settled down, the howling wind fading into a nervous, icy static. I was curled into a tight, pathetic ball near the baseboards. The biological crash was tearing my nervous system apart. Every instinct screamed for an alpha, for warmth, for the chemical relief of a claiming bite to neutralize the agonizing fever. My distressed pheromones were practically begging for it, saturating the air with desperate, unrefined omega need. I heard Vaughn's heavy footsteps approach. They stopped 3 feet away. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. The alpha biology was a mechanical force. No man could resist an omega in a full unmedicated drop. He was going to touch me. He was going to take control, and I was too weak to stop him. A sob of pure frustration tore itself from my throat. Don't I choked out my voice, a ragged, broken whisper. Please. Vaughn let out a harsh, ragged breath. I could smell his scent spiking the dark cedar wood, and smoke surging desperate to blanket me to claim the distress. I heard the rustle of heavy fabric, but the hands never touched me. Instead, a heavy charcoal cashmere overcoat suddenly landed over me. It covered me entirely, engulfing me in darkness and the overwhelming undiluted scent of Vaughn's natural pheromones. It was heavy, warm, and suffocatingly safe. I immediately buried my face in the collar, my trembling hands clutching the expensive wool like a lifeline. "I'm not touching you." Jesse Vaughn's voice came from above. It was completely wrecked, vibrating with the sheer agonizing effort of holding his own biology back. "Build your nest. You're safe." I heard his footsteps retreat rapidly. I peeked out from beneath the collar of the coat, my vision blurry with feverish tears. Vaughn had crossed the foyer and shoved open the door to the small downstairs guest bathroom. He went inside and slammed the door behind him. The lock clicked loudly. A second later, the sound of the shower turning on echoed through the wood. He hadn't just walked away. He had locked himself inside and turned on the freezing water to brutally suppress his own alpha instincts. He was willing to sit on the floor of an icy shower all night, fighting his own agonizing biology just to ensure I had absolute uncompromised safety in my worst moment. I pulled the heavy cashmere coat tighter around my shaking shoulders, the realization hitting me harder than the fever. The billionaire hadn't conquered me. He had conquered himself. And as the painful cramps slowly began to dull under the scent of his coat, I closed my eyes and let the tears finally fall. Waking up from an unmedicated heat drop feels like surviving a severe car crash. Your bones ache, your skin feels raw, and your brain is a sluggish, hollowed-out cavern. When I finally opened my eyes, the foyer was flooded with harsh, blinding winter sunlight. I was still curled on the floorboards, buried deep beneath the heavy charcoal cashmere coat. The scent of dark cedar wood and smoke was ingrained in my pores, a phantom weight holding me down. The house was dead silent. The howling wind from last night was gone. Barnaby was quiet, and the shower in the downstairs bathroom had been turned off. I sat up slowly, every muscle in my back screaming in protest. I pulled the coat tighter around my shoulders, shivering as the cool morning air hit my sweat-dampened shirt. The heavy oak front doors were still bolted shut. The blood from the thugs had been meticulously scrubbed from the stone fireplace, leaving only a faint, sterile smell of industrial bleach in the air. I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaking, and headed toward the kitchen. I needed water. I needed to figure out how to salvage the wreckage of my life. Vaughn was sitting at the mahogany dining table. He was back in his armor. He wore a fresh, perfectly tailored navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie. The brutal, desperate alpha who had thrown men into the snow and locked himself in a freezing shower was completely gone. In his place sat the untouchable billionaire, tapping away on a sleek silver tablet, a cup of black coffee steaming next to him. He looked up when I entered. The dark circles under his eyes were prominent, a silent testament to a night spent fighting his own biology, but his expression was entirely unreadable. "There's breakfast on the counter," he said. His voice was smooth, carrying that low corporate resonance. "My team came by early. The mess has been handled." I looked at the kitchen island. A silver catering tray held an array of fresh pastries, eggs, and expensive fruit. My stomach churned. The rich, buttery smell was nauseating to a digestive system that had been running on fumes and cheap sage for weeks. "I'm not hungry," I rasped my throat, feeling like sandpaper. I reached into the pocket of my canvas overalls, which I had discarded on a bar stool last night, and pulled out my cracked phone to check the time. The screen lit up. There was a notification from my bank. I stared at the cracked glass. I blinked my sluggish brain, trying to process the numbers. I opened the app, my thumb hovering over the screen. Direct Deposit Sterling Holdings, LLC, amount 50,000.00. The air in my lungs turned to solid ice. The lingering warmth from the cashmere coat suddenly felt suffocating, like a trap snapping shut around my throat. I looked up from the screen, staring at the man in the navy suit. "What is this?" My voice was a breathless, hollow whisper. Vaughn set his tablet down. He didn't look guilty. He looked practical. My assistant contacted the collection agency in Albany. We bought your debt. Your van is currently being delivered back to your previous address. The surplus funds are to ensure you don't find yourself in a similar position again. He said it so casually, like he was paying for a parking ticket. You bought my debt. I repeated the words, tasting like ash. You were physically compromised, Jesse Vaughn stated, standing up. He took a step toward me, his alpha instincts clearly satisfied by the act of providing. You were targeted because of a financial vulnerability. I eliminated the vulnerability. You eliminated my agency. I fired back, my voice suddenly sharp, cracking like a whip in the quiet room. My fading scent spiked with a harsh, bitter ozone. I didn't ask for a bailout. I didn't ask you to fix my life. Vaughn frowned, his jaw tightening. This is pride, Jesse. It's irrational. You were freezing to death. You were being hunted by bottom feeders. I have the resources to make that stop, so I did. Why does it matter how it gets solved? Because now I'm just another problem you paid to go away. I yelled, my hands shaking as I slammed the phone onto the granite counter. Last night, I thought you actually saw me. You sat in that freezing water, so you wouldn't take advantage of my biology. But you just found a different way to buy me this morning. I didn't buy you. Vaughn growled, the alpha edge bleeding into his tone, frustrated by my refusal to accept his protection. I paid a bill. To me, 50 grand isn't a bill, Vaughn. It's my entire life. I turned my back on him. I couldn't look at him anymore. The realization was a physical pain in my chest, sharper than the cramps of the heat drop. He hadn't respected my boundaries. He had simply replaced the biological claim with a financial one. To a billionaire, everything was a transaction. Last night was just a service he felt he owed me for. I marched into the foyer. I didn't bother folding his expensive coat. I let it slip off my shoulders, pooling on the floorboards like a discarded shadow. I grabbed my dented metal toolbox. As I lifted it, a heavy iron wrench floated out of the tray, hovering at eye level. The temperature in the foyer dropped 10 degrees. Don't Barnaby's cold energy seem to whisper. Not today, Barnaby, I muttered, snatching the wrench out of the air and shoving it back into the box. I'm clocking out. I walked back to the dining room. Vaughn was standing exactly where I left him, looking entirely out of his depth. The great CEO had encountered a problem that capital couldn't solve, and he was paralyzed by it. I pulled a crumpled piece of invoice paper from my pocket and uncapped a black marker with my teeth. I slammed the paper onto the mahogany table. I wrote furiously, the marker squeaking against the wood. Plumbing, caulking, and physical exorcism services. Total hours 62. Materials including ghost-damaged primer 115.50. Total amount due 1,355.50. I pulled up my banking app. I typed in the routing number for Sterling Holdings, which was conveniently attached to the deposit. I authorized a transfer. There, I said, my voice dead and flat. I kept exactly 1,355.50. That is my wage. I earned every single cent of it. The remaining 48,644.50 has been returned to your account. Go buy another roll of artisan duct tape with it. Vaughn stared at the greasy invoice paper, his dark eyes wide, a sudden profound realization dawning on his face. He reached out his fingers, brushing the paper. Jesse, don't I cut him off, picking up my heavy toolbox. The iron handle bit into my cracked palms, but the pain was grounding. It was real. It belonged to me. The pipes in the basement are stabilized. The draft in the library is sealed. The job is done, Mr. Sterling. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked out the heavy oak front doors, stepping off the porch and sinking my worn boots into the freezing upstate New York snow. The cold air hit my face like a slap, but I kept walking down the long, treacherous driveway, refusing to look back. The upstate New York winter didn't care about my pride. By the time I was halfway down the mile-long driveway, the freezing wind had sliced right through my thin canvas jacket. My boots were sinking into calf-deep snow, and my toolbox felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Every step was an agonizing reminder of the heat drop. I had barely survived the night before. My muscles screamed, but the hollow, burning ache in my chest was much worse. I had let myself believe just for a few hours that I was more than a transaction. I was 10 feet away from the massive wrought iron gates when I heard the heavy, frantic crunch of snow behind me. Jesse, stop. I didn't stop. I kept my head down, pushing against the wind, but the footsteps were faster, driven by long, desperate strides. Suddenly, a violent gust of unnatural freezing wind whipped around me. It wasn't the winter weather, it was a localized supernatural gale. With a deafening metallic crash, the heavy iron gates ahead of me violently slammed shut. Thick, crystalline frost instantly spiderwebbed across the black iron bars, welding the latch shut with a layer of solid ice. I dropped my toolbox, staring at the frozen barrier. "Are you kidding me, Barnaby?" I yelled into the howling wind. "I forgave you for the primer. Let me out." No, the icy air seemed to whisper against my neck. "Jesse." I turned around. Vaughn was standing 10 yards away. He was breathing hard, a cloud of white vapor escaping his lips with every exhale. He had run out of the manor without his overcoat. He was just wearing his expensive navy suit trousers and a white dress shirt completely exposed to the freezing blizzard. The untouchable billionaire looked frantic, messy, and entirely human. "Open the gate, Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice shaking from the cold and the sheer exhaustion. "My job is done." "I can't," Vaughn rasped, taking a slow step forward, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "And even if I could, I wouldn't. Please, just listen to me." Listen to what I snapped, wrapping my arms around myself. "You bought my debt. You cleared my ledger. You proved that down here on the ground, I'm just another problem you can throw capital at until it disappears." "I didn't buy you." Vaughn shouted, the raw frustration tearing through his corporate composure. He closed the distance between us, ignoring the biting wind. I panicked, Jesse. I saw the invoice from that predatory agency. I saw how they were suffocating you. I have the resources to eliminate the threat, so I did. I didn't think about your pride. I didn't think I just wanted you safe. He stopped 3 feet away from me. He looked down at his own shaking, freezing hands, a bitter, self-deprecating laugh escaping his chest. "I don't know how to do this," Vaughn confessed, looking up at me. His dark eyes were stripped of every ounce of CEO arrogance. "My entire life, I've been taught that money is the only armor that matters. But it doesn't work on you. It just drives you away. I'm a billionaire, and I have absolutely nothing of value to offer you." I stared at him. The freezing wind whipped his dark hair across his forehead. He was shivering violently, but he refused to step closer, refusing to use his alpha pheromones to force a biological submission. Before I could answer, the snow beneath our feet vibrated. A rhythmic phantom ticking echoed from the direction of the manor. The heavy, oppressive cold of the poltergeist suddenly shifted, pulling back toward the house like a receding tide. Barnaby wasn't just throwing a tantrum, he was leading us. I looked at the frozen gates, then at Vaughn. "He wants us to follow him," I muttered, picking up my toolbox. 10 minutes later, we were in the deepest, darkest corner of the manor's basement, the old coal cellar where Barnaby had frozen to death 80 years ago. The air here was heavy with centuries of undisturbed dust and the bitter scent of old soot. The phantom ticking grew louder, centering over a section of rotted, warped floorboards near the massive defunct iron furnace. I knelt down, pulling my heavy iron crowbar from my box. I jammed it into the seam of the wood, but my hands were too weak from the cold to gain any leverage. Suddenly, Vaughn dropped to his knees right into the thick black coal dust. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the crowbar with me. Together, we threw our weight backward. With a loud, splintering cracking sound, the rotting wood gave way, revealing the packed dirt beneath. Nestled in the dirt, perfectly preserved by the cold, was a small, tarnished silver pocket watch. The glass face was cracked, stopping the hands permanently at 3:15 a.m. I carefully reached down and picked it up. As my fingers brushed the cold silver, a rush of lingering emotion flooded the room. Not anger, but a profound, crushing sadness. It was an engagement watch. Barnaby hadn't been fighting the cold just to survive. He had been trying to make it home to someone. He dropped it when he was trying to fix the furnace, I whispered, wiping the dirt off the silver casing. As I spoke the words, the heavy, oppressive atmosphere in the basement instantly shattered. The bone-chilling cold evaporated, replaced by the natural, tolerable dampness of an old cellar. The flickering overhead bulb stabilized into a warm, steady yellow light. Barnaby was gone. The haunting was officially over. I sat back on my heels, staring at the watch. Vaughn was kneeling right beside me. His pristine white shirt was ruined with black soot. His hands were scraped and bleeding from the wood splinters. "The job really is done now," I said quietly. Vaughn looked at the watch, then turned his gaze entirely to me. "I don't care about the job, Jesse." He shifted closer. The damp, cold fog of my natural scent leaked out, but this time it wasn't spiked with defensive panic. It was just me. Vaughn inhaled slowly his own dark cedar wood, and smoke rolling out to meet it. But it didn't overwhelm my scent. It wrapped around it a steady, supportive foundation. I don't want the Omega who is biologically compatible with me. Vaughn said, his voice a low, rough rumble. He reached out, his soot-stained fingers gently hovering over my wrist. I want the guy who charges me a ghost tax. I want the guy who yells at me for buying expensive duct tape. I want the man who is too stubborn to quit. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. The walls I had spent my entire life building were cracking under the weight of his absolute clumsy sincerity. I'm a mechanic Vaughn. I fix broken pipes. I don't know how to navigate boardrooms and galas. Good Vaughn said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking across his face. Because I'm sick of boardrooms. Teach me how to fix a pipe. He didn't pull me into an alpha claim. He simply opened his arms asking for permission. I let out a shaky breath, the last of my resistance crumbling into the coal dust. I leaned forward and wrapped my arms around his broad shoulders. Vaughn immediately pulled me tight against his chest, burying his face in the crook of my neck. It wasn't a frenzy of biological instinct. It was a genuine, desperate, profoundly human embrace. It was warm, it was solid, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying the weight of the world completely alone. 6 months ago, my morning routine consisted of burning a 99-cent stick of gas station sage and calculating how many meals I could skip before I passed out. Today, my morning started with the sharp, rich aroma of a freshly pulled espresso shot and the deafening roar of a heavy-duty table saw. Summer in upstate New York had completely transformed Blackwood Manor. The oppressive, freezing graveyard of a house was gone. In its place was a massive, chaotic construction zone flooded with warm, golden sunlight. The heavy velvet drapes had been torn down, the rotting floors ripped up, and the air smelled distinctly of sanded oak, wet plaster, and dark cedar wood. I stood in the center of the grand foyer, wiping a layer of fine white drywall dust from my forehead with the back of my hand. I was wearing my usual heavy canvas overalls, but these weren't threadbare or patched with duct tape. They were new. And clipped to the front pocket was a laminated badge bearing my name and a freshly minted state-approved general contractor's license. When Vaughn and I had walked out of that coal cellar together, I made one thing absolutely clear. I wasn't going to become a billionaire's pet Omega. I didn't survive 24 years of grinding poverty just to trade my rusty van for a gilded cage. If he wanted to be with me, he had to let me be me. So, I pitched a formal bid to renovate Blackwood Manor. I drafted a meticulously itemized budget. Vaughn had tried to sneak a 300% profit margin into my contract, and I had threatened to break his custom-built espresso machine with a pipe wrench. We eventually settled on a fair market rate. He was the client, I was the boss. Jesse! A strained heavy grunt echoed from the top of the grand staircase. I looked up and couldn't stop the wide, entirely unapologetic grin from spreading across my face. Vaughn Sterling, the ruthless CEO of a multinational real estate holding company, was currently wrestling with a 60-pound bucket of industrial joint compound. He was wearing a pair of Carhartt work pants that I had forced him to buy a white t-shirt that was already ruined with gray smears and heavy work boots. The man who regularly commanded boardrooms full of terrified executives looked completely out of his depth on a staircase. You know, Vaughn gritted out his biceps, bulging as he awkwardly hauled the heavy plastic bucket down the final 3 steps. I pay a team of highly trained professionals to handle logistics for a reason. I am paying you to handle this. It's Sunday Sterling. I called back, leaning against a stack of 2x4s, thoroughly enjoying the view. My crew is off the clock. And you're the one who decided you couldn't live without the open concept arches in the dining room. If you want them mudded by Monday, grab a trowel. Vaughn dropped the bucket onto the subfloor with a heavy, exhausted thudding sound. He stood up, wiping a streak of white plaster across his sharp jawline. He was breathing hard, a light sheen of sweat catching the morning sun. He looked ridiculous. He looked tired, and he looked happier than I had ever seen him. The chronic insomnia that used to paint dark, bruised circles under his eyes was entirely gone. Every night, wrapped in the damp, cool fog scent of my natural pheromones, the billionaire slept like a rock. He crossed the foyer, his dark eyes locking onto mine. He didn't use an alpha command to close the distance. He just walked over to me, entirely human, entirely mine. He stopped a few inches away. His natural scent, the deep, smoky cedarwood, rolled over me, but it didn't trigger my defensive instincts anymore. It didn't feel heavy or suffocating. It wrapped around my own scent, a perfect steady equilibrium. "I am a billionaire," Jesse Vaughn murmured, reaching out and gently flicking a wood shaving off the collar of my shirt. "I could hire a helicopter to airlift this bucket from the stairs to the dining room." "Sure you could," I snorted, reaching into my tool belt. I pulled out a heavy steel putty knife and slapped it directly into his chest. Vaughn caught it clumsily. "But then you wouldn't get the character-building experience of manual labor. Now go stir the compound. It is getting stiff." Vaughn let out a low, rumbling laugh, the sound vibrating deep in his chest. He didn't complain anymore. He just leaned down and pressed his lips to mine. It wasn't a desperate, feverish bite driven by biological imperative. It was a slow, grounding kiss that tasted like expensive coffee and drywall dust. My hands instinctively found the broad expanse of his shoulders, the coarse fabric of his work shirt, grounding me in reality. We weren't a fairy tale. We were just two vastly different people trying to build something solid out of a ruined foundation. A loud, deliberate clattering noise broke the moment. We both pulled back, looking toward the living room archway. A stack of freshly laundered and perfectly folded bath towels was hovering 3 feet in the air, slowly gliding across the room toward the downstairs bathroom. Barnaby had stayed. Once his tether to the coal cellar was broken, the violent, freezing poltergeist had vanished, leaving behind a rather fussy, transparent roommate. He no longer froze my primer or hid my 10mm sockets. Instead, he apparently had a strong, spectral opinion on how laundry should be folded. "Show off," I muttered at the floating towels. The towels gave a subtle, sassy shimmy in the air before disappearing around the corner. Vaughn chuckled, wrapping his arms around my waist from behind and resting his chin on my shoulder, entirely unbothered by the ghost doing our chores. "You know," Vaughn said softly, watching the dust motes dance in the sunbeams filtering through the newly installed windows. "When I bought this place, I thought I was just buying a quiet place to hide. And instead, you bought a haunted money pit and a mechanic with a bad attitude," I said, leaning back against his solid chest. "Best investment I ever made," Vaughn replied, his voice a low, warm vibration against my skin. I smiled, letting my eyes close for just a second. I listened to the quiet hum of the house, the steady heartbeat of the man holding me, and the faint, ghostly rustling in the other room. The pipes were fixed. The walls were stable. We still had a long way to go, and I was definitely going to make the billionaire sand the drywall himself. But as I stood there in the sunlight, I realized something profound. Life wasn't about waiting for someone to rescue you from the cold. It was about finding someone willing to pick up a wrench, get their hands dirty, and help you fix the broken pieces together.